Welcome to this coffee instruction class. Coffee instruction class. You are here to learn about brewing coffee. And why knowing how to brew a proper cup of coffee is so important. Now, as I set up, I think it's important for us to discuss what exactly I mean by a proper cup of coffee. Now, I think we're all familiar with the taste of coffee. Some might like it, some might not. But I think that most of us, at least in our day and age, drink some form of caffeine throughout the day. For most of us, that's coffee. I know that for the longest time, I believed that if you add enough milk or sugar to your coffee, it's palatable and something that will give us the energy that we want for the day, and that's all there is to it. But as I hope to show you throughout this class, not only can coffee provide our desired caffeine, but also can be a pleasant and enjoyable experience. Much like fine wine, fine dining, or any other number of specialties, coffee and your coffee experience can be elevated. Before you, you see 5. I know how to count. You see 4 coffees. Before you, you see 4 coffees. All different beans. All different beans. Now, as you can see, they're each labeled. And I'll go through these coffees one by one and describe them in a little bit further detail. Now, this coffee here with the yellow tag is a Colombian single origin. A Colombian single origin. As you can see, it is a fairly light roast. And you will note that a number of these coffees are on the lighter side. We'll get into that in a little bit. Next up here, with the blue tag, is our only blend of the offerings. A blend is simply a mixture of multiple different types of coffees. And this one in particular is a blend of Ethiopia, Uganda, and Sumatran beans. As you can see, it is also the darkest of the 4, and there's a reason for that we'll get into in a moment. Next up we have the Red Tag coffee. This coffee is from Burundi. This coffee is from Burundi. Small country in Africa, for those who may not be aware. Lastly, we have a coffee from Ethiopia, here with the green tag. Ethiopian coffee, Ethiopian coffee. We have an Ethiopian coffee. Ethiopia, of course, is credited as the birthplace of coffee, as it was where the coffee plant was first discovered, before being moved around the world and shared and grown in all sorts of places. Grown in all sorts of places. Now, if you would allow me just a moment to rearrange these coffees, I thought it might be beneficial to arrange these coffees from light to dark, from light to dark. Now, I mentioned a little bit about these coffees, where they're from, but now I want to talk a little bit more about how to decide what kind of coffee might be right for you. So, first of all, where the coffee is grown is quite important, as different countries, different elevations, different growing conditions can yield very different crop. One of the other important things to note, which I will go over next, is how the coffee was processed. Now, processing coffee, what I mean by that is how the seeds, these beans here, were removed from the fruit that grew around them. Coffee is a plant, and the beans that we use to make coffee come from the inside of the fruit. So the fruit is plucked from the plant when it is ripe and brought to process. The most traditional style of processing, and one that is our Burundi and our Ethiopia, is natural process. And a natural process means, well, it means that there's very little equipment involved, nothing besides a little bit of time and nature. So after the fruit of the coffee plant is plucked, it is depulped, and the coffee cherry or the cascara fruit on the outside is removed, and what's left are the beans. But the coffee beans are covered in a layer of, it's called mucilage, as well as little bits of remainder of the fruit that cling to the beans themselves, the seeds. And in order to remove all of that, there needs to be a reduction in moisture. You need to have a reduction in moisture in order for the beans to be dry enough so that they don't ferment or mold during transport or before they're roasted. So to do that, the beans are laid out and spread out across what are known as drying beds. And that allows them to sit in the sun and dry. The mucilage, as it begins to lose moisture and dry, becomes quite papery and flakes right off when processed. The beans can then be sent off, shipped wherever they want to go, and then roasted and enjoyed. The second most common form of processing is utilized for the Colombian coffee. The Colombian coffee is processed with something what's known as washed process. Now, a washed process, as you might be able to guess, is where they use water, fresh water, to rinse off all of that mucilage and residual fruit that clings to the bean. So the beans are run through what's known as a washing station, and the water helps release all of that excess fruit and mucilage, and the beans are allowed then to dry and resume their journey to the roastery. Now, why would you have two different types of processing? And in reality, there's actually quite a few more, but those are the two most popular. Well, you see, coffee beans tend to absorb. They tend to absorb whatever flavors are around them, particularly when they're still unroasted. And coffees that are naturally processed, because they are surrounded by fruit for a longer period of time, can sometimes end up having more vibrant, deeper fruit notes. However, because there's less control over the amount of mucilage on each bean, there's more inconsistency. Sometimes you can have a more muddied flavor, not quite as crisp as with the washed process. With the washed, the water gets rid of most of the fruit rather quickly. The beans don't have nearly as long to absorb flavor. And what you're left with is maybe not as vibrant of a flavor as with the natural, but far more crisp, clean flavors are often associated with washed processed coffees. Now today, you are going to get to go home with a bag of each of these coffees as a thank you for coming to our class. But before you go, we are going to need to talk a little bit about your preference. What kind of coffee you might want to enjoy today. So, with that being said, beyond washed and natural process, one of the most determining factors to the overall flavor of the coffee, of course, is the roast profile. And as you can see here, we have 4 coffees ranging from fairly light to what I would consider a medium roasted coffee. The reason we don't include any dark roasts, French roasts, things like that, is very similar to cooking like a fine steak. As you begin to go from rare to medium to well done, as you reach those darker roasts, those darker cook times, they do all begin to taste the same. You begin to taste the char on the meat, or the roast. You get a very roasty flavor from the coffee, pretty much regardless of any of the other aspects of the coffee. So today we are going to concern ourselves with light to medium. Light to medium. Now, medium roasted coffee, like we have here, is still plenty bold and strong. In fact, a lot of what we consider to be dark roasted coffee can actually be attributed to the dose that we use and the grind size for extraction. Whereas with lighter roasts, like the 3 back here, oftentimes the individual flavors, the unique qualities that make up each of these different regions, countries, cultivars, is allowed to shine through. The darker you roast, the more everything starts to taste the same. The lighter you roast, the more ability you have to taste individual flavors, unique tasting notes, and perhaps even find a coffee that speaks to you. Now, some of these tasting notes. For the Burundi that we have here, as mentioned, is quite light, has a tea-like body, as well as some sweetness notes of honey. The Colombia, as mentioned, is a washed processed coffee, so some of these flavor notes might be a little bit more muted or dampened. But the overall body is quite clean. It has notes of lemon zest, and small hints of a caramel sweetness. The Ethiopia, a natural processed coffee, similar to the Burundi, is going to have much deeper fruit notes, berry sweetness, strawberry, blueberry, as well as a more juicy body. And then our blend here in the center, the medium-bodied coffee, has quite a creamy body, some might even say heavy or dense, with sweetness of chocolate, dark chocolate specifically, maybe even a baker's chocolate, as well as some small hints of raspberry. If we roasted this blend darker, those raspberry notes would disappear. Now, we've talked about the processing. Natural processed, washed processed. I believe 2 of the 3 components in the blend are also natural processed. We've talked about a little bit about the roast profile, the tasting notes. And you can see here all the different choices that you have. We're going to brew a cup of one of these coffees. In fact, we're going to brew 2. One for yourself and one for me. So that we can taste and discuss. Do you have a preference? You'd like to try the blend? That's quite alright, I understand. Sometimes the lighter roasted coffees, you're absolutely right, do have a bit more acidity in them as compared to darker coffees. And while some can find that acidity quite pleasant, I certainly don't fault anyone for wanting to keep that to themselves. So, let me quickly grind some of this coffee, and I'll be right back. Here we have two doses of the ground blend coffee. Now, I ground this just a moment ago, and if you don't have a grinder at home, it is still perfectly fine to have your coffee ground at your local coffee shop, or even buy pre-ground. However, it is worth noting that once the coffee is ground, even if it's in a sealed container, it has a larger surface area compared to the beans. Each one of these little pieces of ground coffee is beginning to oxidize and to be exposed to oxygen, which over time is going to make it go stale. So the more you can keep your coffee a whole bean, perhaps grind right before you use it, the fresher your coffee will be, the fresher it will taste, and the less overall stale flavor it will impart. So, we just ground 2 servings, and I will be brewing both of these right now. The next step is to set up our scale. Now, our scale is going to allow us to know exactly how much coffee we are using, exactly how much water we're using, and what's great about this particular scale is that it also tracks the time. So we'll be able to time our pours of our water precisely. It's important to be precise. When you're brewing coffee, it is important to be precise. When you're brewing coffee, it's important to be precise. Precision is key. Precision is key. Now, I will go fetch us some water, and we'll begin to brew. Now, for just a moment, before I set up the dripper, I wanted to show you the kettle that we're using today. This is what's known as a swan neck kettle, and what this will allow me to do is to pour the water out of the very thin spout directly where I want to pour it. It won't overflow, it won't pour too quickly. It gives me complete control of the water. Now, this kettle is also quite hot. I brew my coffee at boiling. The water is boiling. So we're going to be very careful as we move it about. Now I want to set this up just perfectly so that you can see it. And I think we're going to brew directly into the mug. Excellent. Now you can see the timer at the bottom, the mug itself, which will soon have some delicious coffee in it, as well as the top. Now, this right here, this is our dripper. This is our dripper. It is a circular shaped dripper, and as you can see, there are ridges on the inside to allow the water to flow more freely, as well as one tiny hole at the bottom. And that's where the coffee will come out. That is where the coffee will come out. Next, we have our paper filter. And as you can see, this particular filter has ridges all around the sides. And it is circular in shape as well, to fit neatly into the dripper. You might find other drippers that are V-shaped and have filters to match. Now we are going to take one serving of our coffee. And we're going to bring it into the dripper, into the filter. Now this particular filter and dripper combination, we recommend not pre-wetting your filter. There are plenty of others where if you don't pre-wet the filter, well, let's just say there's a bit of a papery taste that it might impart. However, we don't need to do that with this one. One less step to worry about for us. Now, we are going to want the coffee as evenly spread out as possible. We want it as evenly dispersed. So you can see there's a bit of a mound built up on this side of the dripper. So we're just going to give it a quick shake. And you can see how it is now spread out nice and even. Now, we're going to turn on our scale and timer, and we're going to begin. So I will start the timer and begin pouring. And this is what's called the bloom. This first pour is called the bloom. Think of it like wetting a sponge. We saturate the coffee, but just a little bit there. You can see I only used about 65 grams of water. For the coffee, I used about 30, and a good rule of thumb is to bloom the coffee about double the dose of your water. We let that sit for about 30 to 40 seconds. And then we pour more water. Now we don't pour all of the water here in the beginning, and you can hear it starting to drip through rather quickly now. We don't pour all of the water at once, because it would end up choking up into the coffee itself and oversaturating the beans. No, instead, we pour in roughly 100-gram intervals. We pour from 65 to 150, then to 250, and finally 350. Now 350 grams, we're measuring in grams. 350 grams of water is going to give us, with a little bit from the beans absorbing some of the water, not all of it making it into the cup. Anyway, needless to say all of that, the end result is 1 full cup of coffee. 1 full cup of coffee. 1 full cup of coffee. And as you can see here, the water is slowly draining through the beans, through the grounds of the coffee. And you can hear the dripping is starting to slow. We wait for the moisture to subside. This stage usually takes anywhere between 30 seconds to a minute and a half, depending on the type of dripper you use, the coarseness of your grind. And now you can see it's dried out. The bed of our coffee is quite flat. That's always a good sign. And let me just remove the spent grounds. Now, we can move the dripper off the mug, and voila, we have a beautiful cup of coffee. A beautiful cup of coffee. And all in just about 4 minutes there. Now that can be for you. Allow me to quickly clean the scale. We always want to be very delicate with our scale, since it is a precision instrument. We always want to be very delicate with our scale. It is a precision instrument, after all. But once we've cleaned it up, we can now reset. And voila, the scale is ready to go. Now, there is a little bit of residual coffee liquid here in our dripper. So in order to remedy that, we're just going to take a very small amount of hot water and rinse the dripper. And it flows neatly into the carafe below to avoid any further mess. Now, time for our second cup. And the paper filters make a lovely sound. Wouldn't you agree? Well, now we're going to add our coffee. We will do as before, where we shake the coffee to flatten it out. We'll tare our scale so that we're only measuring the water. We want to be as precise as possible when we brew. And then, finally, we start the time. You can see here on this one it poured to about 66 grams. That's totally fine. Like I said, you want to have roughly double the dose of your coffee. And we had two 30-gram doses. Now the coffee here has bloomed. It has slightly puffed up. And what this is doing is the water is allowing it to degas. Some of the gases that are trapped inside the beans begin to escape. And then after we let that sit, we begin our timed pours. Now the trick here is that while we are timing our pours, we also don't want the top of the coffee to get too dry. If the coffee gets too dry, then it begins to close up, and all of its delicious flavors get locked, never to be enjoyed by you or I. Now you can see I'm not being entirely precise with these pours down to the gram. You'll find as you begin to do this that such an endeavor is somewhat of a fool's errand and rather quite challenging. But within a small wiggle room, we're able to be quite consistent with the amount of water we use and with our overall extraction. Now, that was the last pour to 350. And now we just wait. The coffee will begin to drip through. You can see it's starting to recede right now. And when it's finished, we will each have a delicious cup of coffee to enjoy. There's one for you, and one for me. And allow me to just clean up momentarily. Cheers. I hope you enjoyed this brief coffee class, and if you would like to learn more about coffee, about brewing coffee, if you'd like to see me explain other types of brew methods like AeroPress, French press, cold brew, or maybe even espresso, please let me know in the comments below. I am, as you might be able to tell, quite a coffee nerd, and would love to share some of this knowledge with you all. Please let me know. Have a pleasant evening. Get some rest. And I will see you all very soon. Thanks for watching.